It's time to sit those winning lineups. I'm Jen Piacenti with Sports Illustrated, and joining me today, Michael Fabiano, our senior fantasy analyst, with his best starts and sits for every position. Fabs, let's kick it off with quarterbacks. You're willing to start Dak Prescott versus the Detroit Lions this week, despite what may be a bum thumb, but I really like this call.
Yeah, he is expected to be back, so keep tabs on his status. But the matchup's really good against Detroit. I mean, it couldn't be better for Dak Prescott. They've been crushed by quarterbacks. 4 different quarterbacks, Jen, have scored at least 18 fantasy points against Detroit, including 3 who've gone over 24. So as long as Dak is back, you should start him in fantasy. And the same goes for Tua Tagovailoa. He's expected to return this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, but keep tabs on his status. As long as he's good to go, I like him against the Pittsburgh defense that's given up 17.9 or more fantasy points to 4 different quarterbacks this season.
You're sitting 2 quarterbacks that have actually been very good for fantasy owners this year, but their matchups this Sunday, not so much.
Yeah, can you believe it? Jared Goff is averaging 19 points a game. Jared Goff, it's insane. But I don't love the matchup against the Cowboys. They're going to be salty after losing to the Eagles last week. They've been very tough on quarterbacks. In fact, they've held Jalen Hurts, Tom Brady, and Joe Burrow. They're all really good, all under 17 fantasy points. So Goff is a sit. And so is Trevor Lawrence. Don't chase the points after last week. Did you look at his passing numbers? They weren't very good. He had a big game because he rushed for 2 touchdowns. So the Giants' defense is better than advertised. They've held Lamar Jackson and Aaron Rodgers to modest numbers in games earlier in the season. So Trevor Lawrence is probably better off as a 2 QB option, and that's it.
Let's jump over to the running back position. It looks like Josh Jacobs has actually assumed the bell cow role in Las Vegas, and you say fire him up this weekend.
He's a must start. I love the matchup against the Texans. They're giving up 27 plus fantasy points to running backs this year. This is a great spot for Josh Jacobs, who scored 64.8 combined fantasy points in 2 games before Las Vegas' bye. And then, Jen, let's celebrate a little bit. We could put Ezekiel Elliott into our lineups with some confidence this week, right? Last week he was good. I didn't love the matchup against the Eagles. He gave you a very nice stat line. Now he's got the Lions. Their defense has given up the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs. 3 backs have scored 18 plus points against them. So Zeke and Tony Pollard during the bye week are both viable fantasy starters.
I'm super excited about flexing Tony Pollard in a lot of leagues. I mean, the Detroit Lions, they just give up touchdowns specifically. And so there's enough for Zeke and Pollard to really go off this weekend. So I'm firing him up. As far as who you're sitting, there is news out of Chicago this week that they're going to go with, who is the hot hand at running back. And it sounds like maybe that's not great news for David Montgomery.
Right, and we've got 4 teams off. And both of these running backs I'm going to talk about, you probably have to play. So temper expectations. And Montgomery, last week, he could have had a way better game. Unfortunately, the Bears did not find him open for a touchdown late in the game. But look at the matchup against the Patriots. Their defense has held Nick Chubb, Jamal Williams, J.K. Dobbins, A.J. Dillon, all to single-digit fantasy points earlier this season. So Montgomery is a risky flex. And the same goes for James Robinson. I think we may be seeing a change of the guard in Jacksonville's backfield. Over the last 2 weeks, Travis Etienne has seen an increase in his snaps and his touches. It looks like a 50-50 split now. Etienne's been the better of the 2 backs from a fantasy perspective. So this isn't about the matchup as much as it's about Robinson starting to lose a hold of that featured role in Jacksonville. I actually have Travis Etienne ranked ahead of him for this game.
That makes sense. James Robinson actually had 2 more carries than Travis Etienne, but Etienne was far more productive, especially for fantasy managers. So you could be correct. It could be finally switching over here at week 7. Okay, for wide receiver starts, we got another Seahawk on the list. We love the Seahawks for some reason on this show. We just keep going back to them.
Yeah, and Tyler Lockett, but he had a stinker last week. 3.7 fantasy points. I thought he would smash Arizona. It did not happen. I'm going to keep him in my lineup, though, against the Chargers. They've surrendered 18 plus fantasy points to 4 different wide receivers this year. So I think Lockett bounces back in that game. And hey, how about Allen Lazard? We're not giving him nearly enough credit. I mean, look at his numbers in the last 4 weeks. 13 plus fantasy points in every single game, including 2 games at more than 17 points. He's got the Commanders this week. They've given up the 4th most fantasy points to perimeter receivers. So start Allen Lazard.
I'm looking at your wide receiver sit list right now, and I know what you're going to say. I hear your voice in my head. Don't chase the points. Am I right about Juju?
You are. With Juju. Juju had a big game last week, but we never know which wide receiver it's going to be for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then look at the matchup against the 49ers. They've allowed 2 touchdowns and the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So when you see what Juju did last week, don't go and chase it. I would temper expectations. And then Drake London, who we told you to sit last week. Remember that hot start he had, Jen? He has really cooled down. 15.2 combined fantasy points in his last 3 games. He's got the Bengals this week. It's not a good matchup. Wide receivers who start out at the perimeter of their routes have averaged the 4th fewest fantasy points against Cincinnati after 6 weeks. So Drake London is a fade.
Okay, let's wrap it up with the tight end position, our favorite position. Cleveland Browns have been finding David Njoku. He's been getting the targets. He's operating like the number 2 receiver there. You say fire him up this weekend.
Yeah, the Chief has been very good. 8.8 fantasy points or more in 4 straight games, and we'll take that at the tight end position. During that time, 14.3 points per game in his last 4. That's pretty good. He's got a good matchup against the Ravens. They've allowed 11-plus fantasy points to 4 different tight ends this year, including Daniel Bellinger last week. So start Njoku and start Hayden Hurst. I told you to sit him last week. He had a bad matchup and he had a bad game. Now he's got Atlanta. Hey, it's another revenge game for Hayden Hurst. And look at Atlanta's defense. They've allowed 73 yards per game and the 4th most fantasy points to enemy tight ends. So if you need help at that position, start Hayden Hurst.
Side note, David Njoku also easily surpassed his player prop last week for 39.5 receiving yards. So be sure you always check those out at SI.com as well. And then as far as who you're sitting at the tight end position, if we have the luxury, of course, there's a lot of bye weeks. Who is on the bench this weekend?
Don't chase the points with Mike Gesicki. He's had 2 huge games this year and 4 absolute stink bombs. He's all or nothing. His floor is very low. 2 is back this week. I think that's going to hurt Gesicki. Only 1 tight end has scored more than 9.6 fantasy points against Pittsburgh this season as well. So don't chase the points with Gesicki, and don't chase the points with Noah Fant. He had a good game last week. The matchup was right against Arizona. We thought it would be Will Dissly, but it was Noah Fant. And his fantasy points have actually gone up in 4 straight games. But still, I don't love this matchup against the Chargers. They've allowed just 1 touchdown to a tight end all season long. So Noah Fant is a fade for me this coming weekend.
And my DFS lineups were so bummed that it wasn't Will Dissly last week. But hey, it's a new week. We're going to start again. Thank you so much. As always, Fabs, your advice is spot on. For everything fantasy, visit us at si.com/fantasy. But don't forget to hit that subscribe button here so you don't miss a single video when it comes to start sits or waiver wire.